It begins in silence. Not the peaceful kind that rests over a sleeping town, but the sort that feels alive, breathing in the dark, holding its breath with you. The camera pans across an empty parking lot soaked in drizzle, the last remnants of yellow hospital paint fading beneath cracked asphalt. Above, the letters of the old sign still cling to the building's face, Beacon Hill Medical Center. Some of the letters are missing, leaving it to spell only Beach HL Medical, as if the name itself had been dismantled by time, or by something that didn't want to be remembered. Inside, fluorescent lights flicker with a faint buzz. Hallways stretch endlessly, littered with half-filled 4 bags and paperwork scattered like fallen leaves. Someone's white coat hangs on the edge of a gurney, one sleeve dragging on the floor as though the person who wore it left in a hurry. A plastic cup of coffee sits on a nurse's desk, its surface still rippling faintly, steam curling upward into the sterile air. The timestamp on the security feed reads November 18, 3:17 a.m. That's the same moment all activity inside Beacon Hill stopped. The voice of the narrator breaks the stillness, low, deliberate, unnervingly calm. When investigators entered Beacon Hill the next morning, they expected chaos. What they found was worse, order. It looked as though everyone had simply walked away. Operating Room 4 remains prepped for surgery, scalpels lined perfectly, lights aimed downward, a tray of instruments glinting under the pale glow. But on the monitor beside the table, a patient's vitals flicker faintly, as if the machine had been running all night. The heart rate line pulses, then flatlines, then flickers back again. The air still smells faintly of antiseptic, but underneath it, something else. A metallic tang, sharp and heavy. A nurse's shoe lies on its side near the door, a streak of red trailing from it toward the exit. No bodies. No signs of struggle. Just absence. As the camera moves deeper into the corridor, the silence starts to break. A faint hum echoes from the vents above, mechanical, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Down one hallway, a door marked restricted access swings lightly on its hinge, creaking each time it moves. On the floor beneath it, a line of surgical gloves leads toward the morgue, each one faintly wet at the fingertips. The narrator's voice returns, hospitals are built to hold life and death in the same breath. But when Beacon Hill went dark that night, something refused to leave. Security footage recovered later shows the moment the power flickers. The emergency lights flash red for 3 seconds before everything cuts to black. When they come back on, the corridors are empty. Not a single person can be seen leaving through the main exits. But at 3:22 a.m., 5 minutes after the shutdown, a door on the east wing opens by itself. Motion sensors trigger in Operating Room 4, even though thermal scans show no human presence. One investigator describes what he saw during the first walkthrough: it was warm. The air was warm, like someone had just been working there. The operating tables, the lights, even the instruments, they were still warm to the touch. A generator hums somewhere below, faintly, though the power grid shows no energy consumption for that night. Someone, or something, was still running systems long after the hospital was officially dead. As the camera pans toward the final corridor, the shot lingers on a wall calendar. The date is circled, November 18th. Beneath it, scribbled in pen, the words, "Final phase begins, 3 a.m." The narrator's tone lowers to a whisper, almost intimate. They said the last doctor left at 2:45 a.m. But the power logs say the surgical lights in Operating Room 4 burned until 3:31. A soft click echoes from somewhere in the distance, metal against metal. The sound repeats, like a heartbeat. The camera moves slowly toward the sound, passing through the hallway lined with gurneys covered in sheets. One of them moves slightly, as though stirred by a faint draft. And then, cut to black. Over darkness, the narrator delivers the question that will haunt the rest of the story: if everyone left Beacon Hill that night, who turned off the lights? Long before its corridors fell silent, Beacon Hill Hospital stood at the heart of a town that shared its name, a small, wind-brushed community nestled between forested hills and a river that glimmered like steel under the morning light. Beacon Hill was not the kind of place you'd find on a map unless you were looking for it. It was the kind of town where everyone knew the local grocer by name, where doors stayed unlocked, and where the hospital wasn't just a building, it was a heartbeat. For generations, the hospital was where life began and ended. It was where parents waited in trembling anticipation outside delivery rooms, where children visited grandparents with flowers and whispered prayers. Every graduation, every wedding, every loss, the hospital somehow stood at the center of it all. Locals called it the Beacon, not because of its name, but because it represented hope. If something went wrong, you went to the Beacon. And the Beacon made it right. It had been built in the 1960s, funded partly by the state and partly by a local philanthropist, Harold Finch, a man once known for his generosity and vision. Finch was a quiet figure, always impeccably dressed, who called the hospital his gift to the future. Under his leadership, it grew from a modest clinic into a fully equipped medical facility, 130 beds, an ICU, a research wing, and a surgical unit renowned across the region. And yet, like most things built on trust, the cracks began where no one could see them. The hospital's most respected doctor was Dr. Eleanor Grant, chief surgeon and research director. In the photos still hanging on the town library wall, she's always smiling, a composed woman in her 40s, eyes bright behind her glasses. To the public, she was the embodiment of grace under pressure, the doctor who never lost a patient, who volunteered during the floods, who attended every memorial service for those she couldn't save. Behind that smile, though, some say she carried an exhaustion that didn't sleep. Her colleagues would later admit she often stayed late, sometimes until dawn, locking herself in the restricted surgical wing, working on something she didn't want to discuss. Then there was Nurse Peter Lyle, the kind of man every small town has, endlessly kind, perpetually tired, the one everyone trusted. He had worked at Beacon Hill for 15 years, knew every hallway, every machine, every secret shortcut. He was the hospital's moral center, the bridge between doctors and patients, always defending both. He believed in the hospital more than anyone. Which is why it broke him most when things began to change. In early 2016, rumors started circulating. A few families whispered about missing medical records. A patient who went in for a routine checkup was transferred to another facility, but no one could confirm where. Some night shift staff mentioned surgeries being performed after hours, no official schedules, no patient names. When asked, the administrators dismissed it all as clerical errors. But even Finch, the founder, had started appearing less often. Some said his health was failing, others said he'd simply grown tired of funding a system he no longer controlled. Still, the town refused to doubt. Beacon Hill Hospital had delivered their children, healed their wounds, buried their dead. To question it felt like questioning the town itself. When a journalist from the city came poking around, locals turned him away. "Don't stir up trouble," they said. "The Beacon's done more for us than anyone ever has." By autumn of that same year, however, strange things began to happen. Lights in the hospital were seen burning at odd hours, always in the East Wing, the one Dr. Grant had sealed off for her private research. Trucks would arrive at midnight, unload heavy containers, and leave before dawn. No one knew what they carried. One janitor later told investigators he once saw a patient being wheeled down a corridor under a white sheet, but the shape beneath it wasn't quite human. He quit the next day and left town for good. Meanwhile, Nurse Lyle began keeping a small journal. In it, he wrote about equipment being ordered under false departments, staff being told not to ask questions, and a growing sense that something unholy was happening behind locked doors. His last entry read, "They say it's for medical advancement. But I've seen the charts. These aren't patients. They're subjects." When winter came, the town prepared for its usual Christmas fundraiser, a gala held inside the hospital's main lobby. It was supposed to be a celebration of 50 years of service. Finch was meant to speak, Dr. Grant was to receive an award for medical innovation, and the town choir was to perform. But on the morning of the event, an anonymous letter arrived at the local newspaper's office. It contained only 2 sentences: "Do not go to Beacon Hill tonight. Something will happen, and no one will leave." The editor assumed it was a prank. The event went on as planned. Dr. Grant never appeared. Finch didn't attend. Nurse Lyle was seen briefly near the entrance, speaking hurriedly with a security guard. Then he walked out into the snow and was never seen again. 3 days later, on November 18, the hospital shut down without warning. Phones went unanswered. The gates were locked. By sunrise, Beacon Hill's most trusted institution had vanished from existence. No press release, no explanation, just silence. Yet when the first police unit entered, they found the strangest thing of all. Despite the cold, despite the power outage, the rooms were still warm. The narrator's voice lowers, almost mournful now, as if remembering something sacred that's been lost. For decades, Beacon Hill Hospital had been this town's promise. And in one night, it became its secret. It started as an ordinary Thursday. The evening shift clocked in at 7 p.m., unaware that none of them would ever officially clock out. The hospital buzzed with its usual rhythm, the muted sound of intercom announcements, the rolling of meal carts, the mechanical hum of air filters cycling through the halls. Outside, snow began to fall in thin white threads, brushing against the windows like ghostly fingers. Beacon Hill Hospital had endured dozens of winters, but that night, it felt different. Colder. Too quiet beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. At 9:42 p.m., a nurse named Angela Merritt logged an unusual call to the switchboard. She reported a malfunction in the East Wing, flickering lights, sudden power surges. Maintenance was dispatched, but when they arrived, the lights stabilized. Probably just the generator, one technician joked. But the generator wasn't running. The main grid was fully active. That was the first sign. By 10:15, Dr. Eleanor Grant was performing an emergency appendectomy on a patient named Michael Hanlon, a 32-year-old truck driver who had been admitted with acute pain. 2 nurses and 1 anesthesiologist assisted her. The procedure began smoothly, but just as she made the final incision, the power flickered again, once, twice, then returned. Dr. Grant froze. For the first time that evening, she looked afraid. At 10:18, Nurse Merritt noted in her chart that the surgical clock on the wall had stopped. She wrote, "Time unknown," in shaky handwriting. By 11 o'clock, the hospital's night administrator, Karen Boyd, began receiving calls from departments reporting system glitches. Patient monitors resetting, heart rate readings displaying impossible numbers, pulses of 230 bpm, oxygen levels that flickered between 100 and 0. The IT department tried rebooting the system, but the servers refused to respond. When Boyd phoned the local power company, they confirmed there were no outages on record. In fact, the hospital's power consumption had increased in the last hour. Around midnight, the first 911 call was placed. A nurse in the ICU whispered into the phone, "There's something wrong with the patients. They're moving." The dispatcher assumed panic, a reaction to stress. The call disconnected mid-sentence. When police arrived 10 minutes later, the doors were locked from the inside. Security footage from that night, what little survived, shows confusion spreading like a contagion. Staff moving quickly through the hallways, shouting into radios that don't seem to work. At 12:27 a.m., an evacuation alarm sounds, but no one seems to know who triggered it. One camera in the main lobby shows Dr. Grant walking briskly toward the East Wing, speaking into a headset. Behind her, the power cuts again. Everything goes black for 47 seconds. When the lights return, the hallway is empty. At 1:03 a.m., all telecommunication lines go dead. The hospital's backup systems, designed to function even in national emergencies, fail one by one. But deep in the basement, the generator hums to life. Not automatically, someone had to turn it on manually. Power resumes only in the operating wards. Every other part of the hospital remains in darkness. Witnesses from nearby buildings later reported hearing screams echoing from the direction of Beacon Hill. Others described a low, mechanical whine, like turbines spinning up, then stopping abruptly. A paramedic who arrived on scene shortly after 2 a.m. described it as a sound that didn't belong to anything living or electrical. Inside, one final message was transmitted over the hospital's internal radio system at 2:46 a.m. It lasted less than 4 seconds, a burst of static, followed by a woman's voice, calm but trembling. "They're awake. We can't sedate them." The recording ends with a crash, followed by silence. When emergency crews finally gained access at dawn, they expected carnage, blood, bodies, chaos. Instead, they found eerie stillness. Every door was unlocked, every room intact. Computers were frozen mid-task, screens filled with incomplete data. Half-written patient charts lay scattered across the nurse stations, pens dropped as though their writers had simply vanished mid-sentence. The cafeteria tables were still set for the night shift's meal. Plates half-eaten, coffee cups half-drained. Clocks on every floor had stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m. But the most disturbing discovery came from operating room 4. The surgical table was warm to the touch. Lights above it still glowed, despite the main grid being offline. A faint smell of cauterized flesh hung in the air. The patient's name tag read Michael Hanlon, the truck driver from earlier that night. But his body was missing. Only a blood-stained sheet remained. Forensic teams later confirmed that several operating instruments were displaced, scalpels dulled, retractors bent, and one heart monitor still displaying a faint, flickering rhythm. The line spiked once, then flatlined again as if something inside the room was breathing for just a moment. When investigators reviewed the building's access logs, they found an anomaly. Between 3:17 and 3:31 a.m., doors in the restricted East Wing opened and closed repeatedly, though every registered staff member had already left the building, according to GPS pings from their ID badges. One of the investigators who entered later described the scene in his report. "It felt wrong. Like the air had weight. Every step echoed like we weren't supposed to be there. When we touched the lights, they were hot. Something had been here. Recently." As dawn crept through the windows, the snow outside had turned crimson in streaks near the ambulance bay, a color investigators couldn't trace to any known chemical spill. The narrator's voice returns, steady but quieter now, like someone revealing a wound they can't stop reopening. Hospitals are meant to save lives. But that night, something inside Beacon Hill refused to die. When the first formal investigation into the Beacon Hill shutdown began, the team expected to find a system failure, maybe corruption, maybe human error. What they uncovered instead was an erasure. The kind that doesn't happen by accident. Within 48 hours of the hospital's closure, entire patient records had disappeared from state databases. Medical charts, payroll records, surgical schedules, gone. It was as though the hospital had never existed in any official capacity. Detective Lydia Monroe, a forensic analyst assigned to the case, described it best: "It wasn't just missing data. It was precise. Surgical. Like someone went in with a scalpel and cut the past out of the system." When investigators accessed the hospital's internal servers, they found that every single file created between November 1st and November 18th had been wiped. Not corrupted, deleted intentionally. Yet, on one backup drive stored off-site, they discovered a folder labeled simply, BHN Project Orpheus. It was password-locked, and no one on record knew the credentials. Meanwhile, the physical side of the investigation painted an even stranger picture. Every employee time card in the building, from doctors to janitors, froze at 3:17 a.m., the same minute the power grid recorded a sudden surge before cutting off. What baffled technicians, though, was that the electronic clocks weren't connected to the main power supply. They had backup batteries, meant to keep them running even through blackouts. The odds of them all stopping simultaneously were statistically impossible. At first, investigators suspected tampering, maybe a coordinated data breach. But when digital forensics examined the server hardware, they found faint electromagnetic residue across multiple systems, consistent with a high-intensity pulse. Yet no EMP or surge had been detected in the surrounding area that night. It was as if the hospital itself had generated its own blackout. In the records that did survive, handwritten notes, printouts stuffed in drawers, there were references to surgeries that didn't match any patient files. Names with no medical ID numbers. Procedures marked as Phase 3 and regenerative containment. The handwriting belonged to Dr. Eleanor Grant. One nurse's notebook, later recovered from her locker, contained a cryptic line: "She said they opened their eyes." But even more chilling were the bio-waste logs. According to disposal records, 3 post-operative cleanups were conducted after the official shutdown order. The last entry was time-stamped 3:29 a.m., 12 minutes after the entire hospital supposedly lost power and was evacuated. Each entry listed the attending physician as E. Grant. Detective Monroe's team pulled surveillance data to match these events. But by then, the footage was gone, overwritten by an automated process that wasn't scheduled to run for another 2 weeks. Still, they recovered fragments, frames showing flickers of movement in the East Wing, figures in surgical masks illuminated by operating lights. Their motions were deliberate, clinical, but something about the way they moved seemed wrong. Too slow. Too synchronized. Technicians reviewing the footage described hearing faint audio beneath the static, a rhythmic, pulsing noise that wasn't mechanical. When isolated, it almost resembled a heartbeat. Meanwhile, staff interviews yielded more confusion than clarity. Of the 19 employees questioned, only 5 agreed to speak on record. Most said they remembered the night vividly but couldn't explain what had happened. Their stories shared a pattern: time distortion, memory gaps, sensations of déjà vu. One nurse broke down crying mid-interview, whispering, "It felt like the building was watching us." Another employee claimed that before the power went out, Dr. Grant had called an emergency meeting in the research wing, gathering a small team of specialists for an urgent continuation. But no one outside that group knew what the continuation was. No one had authorization to enter the East Wing after midnight, yet door sensors showed over 30 separate entries between 2 o'clock and 3:15 a.m. The names attached to those entries didn't exist in the hospital's database. When the investigative team tried to cross-reference those IDs, they found no matches in state employment systems. It was as though a ghost staff had worked that night. Even more alarming, Nurse Peter Lyle, the man who had served at Beacon Hill for 15 years, failed to appear for questioning. His home was empty, his belongings untouched, his car parked in the driveway with keys still in the ignition. On the passenger seat, investigators found his hospital ID badge and a half-burned document. The remaining visible words read, "If they wake, don't let them see the light." Forensic teams combed the East Wing for clues. In Operating Room 4, they found streaks of dried fluid on the floor, not blood, not any known biological compound. Laboratory tests couldn't identify it, the substance contained organic material but showed no cellular structure. It was as if something once living had been melted down and spread thin. At the end of the hall, behind a locked door labeled Storage B, they discovered something stranger still: 3 empty gurneys, restraints broken, the sheets beneath them scorched in neat circular patterns, burn marks that matched defibrillator arcs, but with no signs of electricity ever being used. A lone fingerprint was recovered from one of the steel trays, smudged but identifiable. It belonged to Dr. Grant. The timestamp? 3:22 a.m. But according to every record, and to the GPS data from her staff badge, she had left the building at 2:45. The inconsistencies piled higher with each day. Hospital blueprints didn't match the actual layout investigators explored. A corridor shown on paper as 40 meters long extended nearly 60. Rooms appeared sealed from within, their contents untouched for years, though the hospital had closed only days earlier. When Detective Monroe tried to file her report, she received an order from above. Federal jurisdiction had been invoked. All evidence was to be transferred immediately. Within hours, Beacon Hill was classified as a restricted site. Before the transfer, Monroe took one final look at the OR logs. At the very bottom of the printout, a single unfinished note appeared beside the last recorded timestamp. Written in Dr. Grant's handwriting, it read, Subject 6, Stable. Preparing for reawakening. Monroe's closing statement in her private diary would never make it into the official record. But the handwriting was steady, almost defiant. We thought we were investigating a hospital that went dark. But what if we were investigating one that never stopped? 6 months after the Beacon Hill incident was sealed under federal classification, whispers began to resurface, not in official reports, but through encrypted emails, underground medical forums, and untraceable phone calls. They all mentioned one name, Dr. Eleanor Grant. The woman presumed missing since the night of the blackout. According to the death certificate quietly filed weeks after the closure, Dr. Grant had died in the line of duty during an evacuation. But no body was ever recovered, and no autopsy was performed. The first confirmed sighting came from a man named Samuel Vega, a retired paramedic who claimed to have seen her in an abandoned subway terminal beneath Boston. He described her as pale, gaunt, but unmistakably alive, standing beside what looked like an old medical transport crate. When questioned by investigators, Vega insisted her eyes were glowing faintly blue in the dim tunnel light. Authorities dismissed his report as delusion, citing his history of PTSD. Yet when detectives followed up, they found fresh footprints leading away from the tunnel, matching Dr. Grant's shoe size exactly. Soon after, a series of unexplained thefts struck local hospitals: refrigerated biological samples, vials of synthetic stem cultures, and classified compounds typically reserved for high-security labs. Surveillance cameras always failed during the thefts, each time showing static for exactly 11 minutes. In one hospital, a security guard claimed he saw a woman wearing a surgical coat embroidered with the letters BHN. When he shouted, she turned, and vanished into the stairwell without triggering a single door alarm. Behind the scenes, former Beacon Hill staff began disappearing one by one. Some vanished from their homes, others quit their jobs and fled the state without notice. Those who remained alive described receiving anonymous messages, usually just one sentence long: "The reawakening is near." The wording matched Dr. Grant's final note in the Beacon Hill logs. Detective Monroe, now operating independently after being forced off the case, began piecing together the fragments that federal authorities had ignored or buried. Her private notes detailed an emerging theory, that Dr. Grant hadn't died but instead had continued her experiments elsewhere. According to Monroe, Project Orpheus had never been about simple regenerative medicine. It was an attempt to reverse biological death entirely, using electromagnetic induction to restart cellular function. In simpler terms, resurrection. In Monroe's hidden audio logs, which surfaced years later, she spoke of following encrypted GPS pings that led her to a rural area outside Salem. There, deep within the woods, she discovered a network of makeshift structures powered by silent generators. Inside one tent, she found surgical tools, oxygen tanks, and blood filtration systems, all marked with the same faded Beacon Hill serial numbers. But what shook her most wasn't the equipment. It was the sound. Beneath the hum of the generators, she heard faint rhythmic thuds, slow, steady, and unmistakably biological. The logs described her finding a sealed containment unit half buried in the dirt. Through its frosted glass window, she saw movement, a figure suspended in a translucent fluid, twitching sporadically. A cable connected the chamber to a monitor displaying erratic waveforms and one steady heartbeat. When Monroe tried to record the readings, her device froze and emitted a high-pitched tone that caused her nose to bleed. She ran. 2 days later, her home was broken into. Files, recordings, hard drives, everything related to the Beacon Hill investigation was stolen. Only one item remained, a small paper envelope containing a lock of hair and a note. The handwriting matched Dr. Grant's. It read, "They are learning to breathe on their own now." Authorities later confirmed that the DNA in the hair did not belong to Dr. Grant, or to any registered human genome. It was, as one analyst put it, something close, but not entirely human. After this, Monroe went into hiding. She sent her final email to a trusted colleague at the Boston Medical Examiner's office. The message contained no text, only a series of coordinates and an audio file titled session_0_Grant. The file, later leaked online, captured a woman's voice, soft, calm, detached. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Death is an interruption, not an ending. We have crossed the threshold once. We can cross it again. Background noises in the recording matched the echo pattern of an underground space, possibly concrete, possibly steel. Analysts identified faint electrical buzzing and the occasional clinking of metal instruments. At timestamp 3:47, a second voice can be heard whispering, though it's mostly inaudible. When enhanced, a few words emerge, subject 6, awake. Weeks after the leak, a fisherman found several sealed medical containers washed ashore near the Massachusetts coastline. The labels were partially dissolved, but one still read, "Property of Beacon Hill Neurological." Inside were preserved tissues unlike anything seen before, human in structure but with altered vascular patterns, as if adapted to function without oxygen. Around the same time, sightings of a woman matching Dr. Grant's description spread across the East Coast. In every report, she was wearing a lab coat and carrying what looked like a portable incubator. Witnesses described her demeanor as serene, almost mechanical. One chilling consistency united every account: the air temperature reportedly dropped several degrees wherever she stood. When federal agents attempted to reopen the investigation, they found the Salem facility had been burned to the ground, no bodies, no evidence, no trace of biological material. But scorched into the concrete foundation was a single word, written in charred residue, ORPHUS. For months afterward, hospitals across New England reported strange anomalies: power surges in morgue refrigeration units, flickering monitors displaying heartbeats from inactive patients, and unexplained resuscitations lasting only minutes before sudden failure. Each incident occurred precisely at 3:17 a.m., the same time every system at Beacon Hill had frozen. In her final entry, Detective Monroe wrote something that blurred the line between science and nightmare: Dr. Grant didn't fail. She succeeded. The question isn't whether she brought them back, it's whether she ever meant to let them die. And from that moment onward, the whispers about Project Orpheus were no longer about a hospital experiment gone wrong, but about something that had crossed beyond medicine, beyond ethics, and possibly beyond humanity itself. The storm had rolled in without warning, thunder cracking over the Massachusetts coast as if the sky itself was trying to wake the dead. Rain lashed against the boarded windows of Beacon Hill Medical's East Wing, though the building had been abandoned for nearly a year. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and silence, broken only by the occasional creak of expanding wood. Yet beneath that stillness, something was stirring. Federal agents had returned that night. A small team led by Agent Marcus Heller, a pragmatic investigator who'd built his career uncovering government cover-ups no one else dared touch. He'd been warned not to reopen the Beacon Hill files, not after what happened to Detective Monroe. But he couldn't ignore the reports. Hospitals across the region had been experiencing the same phenomena: sudden power spikes, missing tissue samples, and electronic signatures traced back to Beacon Hill's long-dead grid. Something, or someone, was reactivating the hospital's systems remotely. The team entered through the loading dock, flashlights cutting through the darkness like surgical blades. The generator room was the first stop, though none of the backup units should have been operational. Yet there it was, a faint electrical hum pulsing through the walls. "It's impossible," one technician muttered, checking his meter. "The power feed's live." But the grid shows nothing connected. They followed the current deeper into the hospital, toward the east wing. Every step echoed in the hollow corridors. Surgical charts still hung on walls, frozen mid-shift, with notes about a Phase 2 trial written in Dr. Grant's unmistakable handwriting. Each page bore the same patient initials, S.L. The initials didn't match any hospital records. Then came the smell, faint, chemical, and oddly familiar. Antiseptic. Fresh antiseptic. Heller froze. "This isn't old," he whispered. "Someone's been here." In the center of the east wing lay the silent ward, the part of the hospital that had always been sealed to the public. It wasn't listed on blueprints or patient directories. During its operational years, only a handful of staff had clearance to enter, all of them now missing or dead. As Heller's team approached, they saw something impossible: the electronic door panel glowing green, unlocked. Inside, the room was pristine. Too pristine. Stainless steel counters gleamed under functioning surgical lights. Fresh gauze, sealed syringes, and sterilized instruments were neatly arranged beside what appeared to be an operating chair. A faint condensation clouded the nearby glass wall, as if the temperature inside the adjoining room was drastically lower. When one agent wiped away the fog, she stumbled back, her light trembling. On the other side of the glass was a figure, humanoid, submerged in a vertical tank filled with a clear viscous fluid. Tubes ran from its limbs to machines that pulsed faintly, mimicking a heartbeat. Its eyes were closed, skin pale but smooth, untouched by decay. And yet, as the agents watched, one finger twitched. Then another. The heart monitor beside the tank blipped once, beep, then again, steadying into rhythm. The agent nearest the console gasped. "That's not possible, there's no power running to this unit." Heller moved closer, his breath fogging the glass. "Record everything," he ordered. "Every sound, every reading." Suddenly, the lights flickered. The air grew colder, as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. One of the monitors flashed briefly, a single line of text appeared on the screen: "Reawakening phase, active." Then the entire system went dark. Panic erupted. The doors behind them slammed shut with a hydraulic hiss. Emergency lights bathed the room in red. Static filled their radios, followed by a faint whisper, almost melodic, like a woman humming through a stethoscope. The voice was fragmented but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come back." The figure in the tank opened its eyes. They were not human eyes. The pupils were thin and glassy, shifting colors like oil in water. The heart monitor blared erratically as bubbles began to rise in the liquid. The figure's head tilted, its gaze following the movement of the nearest agent. The sound of metal creaking filled the air as the glass began to crack, a thin fracture running down the center like a scar splitting open. Heller shouted for the team to retreat. But before they could, the emergency lights cut out entirely. The last thing the cameras captured was a blur of movement and a sound, not a scream, but a wet, guttural gasp, as if something was breathing for the first time in centuries. When power was restored an hour later, the ward was empty. Every agent's weapon and radio remained, neatly arranged on the counter. Their body cameras recorded static for 11 full minutes, the same duration as the blackout that shut down the hospital a year before. The only sound on the recovered audio was faint dripping and the rhythmic thud of machinery still running somewhere below. The next morning, Heller's SUV was found idling by the old access road. The driver's seat was empty, door open, headlights still on. Inside the glove compartment was a single flash drive labeled silent_ward. When authorities opened it, the only file contained footage of the hospital's east wing, but the timestamp showed it had been recorded 36 hours in the future. In the footage, the same corridor appeared again, but this time, the lights were on, the halls clean, and figures in surgical masks moved methodically through the rooms. They weren't ghosts or illusions. They looked like doctors. And in the background, faintly visible through the operating glass, a woman in a white coat observed them silently. Her ID tag caught the light just long enough for the camera to focus, Dr. Eleanor Grant. Her lips moved, though the footage had no sound. Forensic lip readers later claimed she said a single phrase, repeated twice. By the time the footage from the silent ward surfaced, Beacon Hill had already transformed from a crime scene into a legend. The public version of the story was simple: a routine medical evacuation gone wrong, an electrical failure, and an exaggerated rumor about missing staff. But the truth was nowhere near that clean. Every piece of evidence that had ever pointed toward Project Orpheus was disappearing. Not misplaced, erased. Detective Monroe's private research archives were wiped remotely 3 days after the silent ward flash drive reached the FBI. Even physical copies, printed reports, photographs, sealed documents, were stolen from secure storage. The agents assigned to the file began reporting strange inconsistencies, timestamps shifting, CCTV footage replaying moments that never occurred, voice notes altering themselves mid-playback. It wasn't just a cover-up anymore, it was as if the case itself was rewriting history. The FBI's Digital Forensics Unit isolated a series of encrypted data fragments that had somehow replicated across multiple servers. These fragments contained pieces of medical reports, incomplete patient charts, and audio logs, all signed by E. Grant, M.D. The language within was detached, clinical, but occasionally fractured by emotion. Subject 7 shows promising neural reanimation patterns. Memory retention remains unstable. The heart responds, but the mind resists. It doesn't want to come back. Investigators believed these were old Beacon Hill files resurfacing, until they noticed the metadata. The files weren't created in the past, they were recent. Every log bore a timestamp from within the last 72 hours. When analysts traced the IP origin, it led them to an internal government network, one that had been inactive since the 1990s. The server location was listed under an old research division of the Department of Defense, Orpheus Medical Defense Initiative, OMDI. The revelation forced officials into silence. Access to the case was revoked. Heller's name was removed from every report, and the flash drive from the silent ward was classified non-existent. But Heller had already made a copy. Late one night, from a safe house in Maine, he uploaded a portion of the recovered footage to a secure drive. Hours later, an anonymous email appeared in his inbox. The subject line read, "You've seen what isn't meant for eyes." The body contained only one attachment, a still image from the silent ward video. In the image, Heller himself stood in the corner of the room, though he remembered being behind the camera. The timestamp beneath the image was dated 3 days ahead of the present. He tried to contact his team. None responded. Their phones rang endlessly before cutting to static. When local police entered their homes, every trace of them, photos, IDs, fingerprints, had been erased, as though they had never existed. Even their families couldn't recall details about them for more than a few seconds before confusion set in. One wife told investigators, "I know he worked for the government, but I can't remember his face." Desperate, Heller drove to Beacon Hill one final time. The hospital had been condemned and scheduled for demolition, yet when he arrived, the gates were open. The interior lights were glowing faintly, as if powered by something deep within. His recorder captured every step as he entered the main corridor. "They want to bury it," his voice trembled, "but it's still alive." He reached the administration wing, where the walls were lined with charred file cabinets. The air smelled faintly of copper and ozone. In one of the drawers, he found something untouched by fire, a patient file marked ORPHUS, SL. The name field had been deliberately blacked out, but the photo inside was intact. It showed a young woman, mid-20s, her eyes half closed, electrodes placed on her temples. The signature beneath read, "Dr. Eleanor Grant, Primary Examiner." As Heller examined the file, the power flickered again. The emergency lights bathed the hallway in crimson. And then, from the intercom above, a woman's voice echoed faintly, "Agent Heller, you shouldn't be here." He froze. The voice was calm, clinical, with a strange modulation, like it was being filtered through multiple speakers. "Dr. Grant," he whispered. The voice responded, "You kept the file. That means it's already inside you." His body camera footage captured the exact moment he dropped the folder. The pages scattered across the floor, each one showing a different image now. Some contained his own medical data. Others showed stills of the silent ward, but with new details added, the patient in the tank now standing upright, its hand pressed against the glass, eyes open. The intercom crackled again. "You wanted the truth," the voice said softly. "But truth doesn't live here anymore." Then, silence. When the camera feed resumed seconds later, Heller was gone. The room was empty. On the wall behind the desk, something new had appeared, faint handwriting in black marker. He joined the trial. After this incident, all references to the Beacon Hill case were expunged from federal systems. Journalists who attempted to report on it found their emails corrupted or their notes replaced with gibberish text. Even archived web pages began vanishing, replaced by 404 errors and random strings of code. Weeks later, a small-town morgue in New Hampshire received a sealed transport case marked "Unidentified Male." Inside was a body with no visible decay, eyes open, and a faint electrical pulse detectable beneath the skin. The tag on his wrist read Heller, M., though the official record still listed him as missing. During the autopsy, the coroner noted that the heart had been surgically reinforced with fine metallic wiring, as if rebuilt. When she made the first incision, the monitors flickered, and a single word appeared on the screen in block letters: "Restart." The coroner's camera went dark after that. To this day, the footage of the silent ward remains sealed in classified archives. But occasionally, fragments resurface, corrupted clips, distorted audio, flashes of rooms that don't exist anymore. Some claim that if you slow the frames enough, you can see faces reflected in the surgical glass, not the faces of the living, but those who were erased. And among them, always at the center, a woman in a white coat stands unmoving, watching. They called her Subject L in the original Beacon Hill files, though the surviving notes hinted at another name: Lydia Hart, a 26-year-old nursing student admitted for a routine neurological assessment 6 months before the hospital's shutdown. Officially, she was listed as a volunteer in Dr. Eleanor Grant's experimental therapy program. Unofficially, she was the foundation of Project Orpheus. Lydia's chart was the first and last complete record before the data purge, and it contained something none of the other files had: vital signs recorded after her time of death. According to the medical logs, Lydia's heart stopped at 2:47 a.m. during a regenerative nerve mapping procedure. The team on site declared her dead after 9 minutes without response. But what happened after that defied all medical logic. At 3:17 a.m., the exact minute Beacon Hill lost power, her vitals returned. For 41 seconds, her pulse reappeared. Then she flatlined again. No one could explain it. The machines had been disconnected, the power grid offline, and yet, she had come back. Her body was never released to family. The official report claimed it had been transferred for further research. But when the shutdown occurred, all biological samples, including Lydia's remains, disappeared from storage. For years, her case was considered one of the many unsolved anomalies buried within the Beacon Hill incident, until whispers began spreading that Lydia Hart was alive. It began with a nurse in Rhode Island who claimed to have treated a young woman matching Lydia's description. The patient arrived during a blackout, escorted by 2 unidentified men in surgical scrubs with no hospital ID. The nurse remembered her clearly: pale skin, a faint surgical scar near her temple, and eyes that didn't blink right. She stayed for less than an hour before vanishing. The room she had occupied was later found sealed from the inside, lights still humming, the temperature a steady 37 degrees Celsius, body heat level. Then came the video. A grainy CCTV clip surfaced on a darknet forum dedicated to unsolved medical cases. It showed a hospital hallway bathed in blue emergency light. A woman in a patient gown moved slowly through the corridor, barefoot, dragging an four stand. Her head tilted in short, unnatural motions, like a puppet following a delayed signal. When she passed the camera, her face turned toward the lens, pale, expressionless, eyes wide. For a fraction of a second, her ID bracelet caught the light. It read, L. Hart. Authorities dismissed the footage as doctored, but digital forensics found no signs of tampering. The hospital in the video, later confirmed as an abandoned wing of Beacon Hill, had been sealed for years. Yet the timestamp on the recording was from 3 weeks earlier. Soon after, reports of hospital anomalies spiked again. Patients declared dead began showing transient signs of life, random muscle movement, sudden spikes in EEG readings, heart monitors flickering back to rhythm only to fail seconds later. One nurse described it as something trying to remember how to live. The occurrences always happened between 3:15 and 3:20 a.m., the same window that haunted every detail of the Beacon Hill case. Dr. Grant's private notes, recovered from a damaged drive, revealed chilling details about Lydia's treatment. She responds differently to neural induction. The process does not restart her, it reconnects her. Her consciousness flickers between the living and the dead. Memory persists in cellular structure. The flesh remembers. In one log, Grant wrote that Lydia had begun speaking after her recorded death. Her voice, faint and mechanical, repeated a single phrase, "It's still dark, but I can hear you." When the Beacon Hill blackout occurred, all communication from the operating wing ceased. But several minutes later, a final transmission was captured from an unregistered channel. It was a short audio burst, 42 seconds of static interrupted by a heartbeat and a faint whisper. Spectrogram analysis revealed the voice of a woman repeating, "I'm awake now." Years later, when Agent Heller vanished, an anonymous package was delivered to the Boston Medical Examiner's office. Inside was a sealed envelope labeled Patient L. The envelope contained a single photograph. It showed a woman lying in a hospital bed, eyes open, a faint smile on her face. She was surrounded by what appeared to be medical personnel, all wearing Beacon Hill uniforms. But the strangest detail wasn't in the faces. It was the background. Through a window behind her, the skyline outside was unmistakably modern, not from the time of the hospital's operation, but from now. Metadata analysis placed the photo's timestamp just 1 month prior. Investigators who examined the image began reporting strange symptoms, nosebleeds, disorientation, and persistent auditory hallucinations, whispers saying, "She's still in there." One technician later claimed that every time he closed his eyes, he saw a corridor bathed in blue light and heard the steady rhythm of a heart monitor. The following week, the technician was found unresponsive at his workstation. His computer screen displayed an open window containing thousands of repeating lines of text, all the same phrase, "Subject L is stable." In the months that followed, emergency rooms across the Northeast reported the reappearance of a woman matching Lydia's profile. She always arrived during power outages, silent, unresponsive, and surrounded by inexplicable electromagnetic interference. Each time, security footage failed, and when power returned, she was gone. Medical teams described her skin as unnaturally warm to the touch, like standing too close to a machine that shouldn't exist. One doctor's notes, recovered from a discarded chart, described the encounter as if Lydia were, not alive but rehearsing life, as if she's remembering what it felt like. The last confirmed sighting came from a clinic in Maine, where an overnight nurse swore she saw a woman lying in the operating room under flickering lights. She looked peaceful, the nurse said. But then she opened her eyes and whispered my name. I'd never seen her before. When investigators arrived the next day, the room was spotless. Only the nurse's ID tag remained, melted into the floor as if fused by extreme heat. On the nearby monitor, faint burn-in text lingered on the screen, "Patient L, condition, reconnected." And for the first time since the Beacon Hill incident, experts began to question whether Lydia Hart had ever truly died at all, or whether she was something else entirely. Something that had crossed the threshold and chosen not to return alone. It began quietly, just whispers among ex-staff who had escaped Beacon Hill before its fall. They spoke of a secondary project buried beneath Project Orpheus, something Grant had only hinted at in passing, the Echo Protocol. According to fragmented notes and corrupted server files, this was the true purpose of Beacon Hill's final experiments, not resurrection, but replication. Grant hadn't been trying to bring the dead back. She had been trying to duplicate consciousness itself. The recovered research logs described it as synthetic cognitive mirroring. The concept was simple in theory but horrifying in execution. By using electromagnetic resonance mapping, Grant believed she could capture the neural pattern of a dying patient at the moment of death, the exact configuration of thoughts, memories, and identity, and imprint it onto a living host. The result wouldn't be a resurrection, but a continuation, a mind copied into new flesh, like a ghost wearing a new body. Most scientists dismissed the theory as madness, but the implications were staggering. If the Echo Protocol worked, death itself could be circumvented, not by healing, but by replacement. The original consciousness would dissolve, leaving behind a living copy. And that copy would believe it was the original. A series of data fragments recovered by Agent Heller before his disappearance revealed the chilling scope of the program. Over 24 patients had been enrolled, all terminal cases. Each underwent neurological mapping just hours before death. But one file stood out, Patient L, Lydia Hart. Grant's notes in that file contained phrases that blurred science and devotion. She's the only one who resonates perfectly. The waveform doesn't collapse. She remembers her death, but it doesn't end her. If Lydia had truly been the first successful Echo, it meant the real Lydia Hart had died long ago, and whatever walked the halls afterward was a copy, carrying her memories like an infection. Investigators later found encrypted correspondence between Dr. Grant and an unknown defense liaison. The emails were clinical, precise, and increasingly unnerving. The process works, Grant wrote. We can capture identity before neural decay. The copies remain stable. They only fail when they remember they're not real. The reply came minutes later, unsigned, then stop letting them remember. This was the key, the reason for the erased data, the vanished witnesses, and the repeating anomalies. The Echo Protocol hadn't failed. It had succeeded so well that it needed to be hidden. The program wasn't shut down, it was moved. By 2023, scattered reports from research facilities across the East Coast described mass electrical disturbances and identity drift among test subjects in clinical trials that officially didn't exist. Several participants complained of déjà vu, false memories, and seeing versions of themselves in hospital reflections. Some began speaking languages they had never learned. Others recited fragments of the Beacon Hill logs word for word. One subject, a 38-year-old veteran named Charles Nolan, wrote in his journal days before vanishing, "Sometimes I dream I'm someone else, a nurse, a patient, a doctor. Sometimes I see them all at once. I think I'm remembering lives that aren't mine." Forensic analysis later revealed that Nolan's neural signature matched 82 with that of Lydia Hart's recorded brain scan, a scan that should have been impossible to access. As these cases multiplied, one unsettling pattern emerged. Every anomaly occurred at 3:17 a.m., the same timestamp that marked Beacon Hill's death. Hospitals started to report unexplained system boots at that exact time, despite being offline. Monitors would flash a single phrase, "Echo stable," before shutting down again. A rogue technician from a government lab in Maryland leaked a series of encrypted files to a journalist. The data contained voice recordings believed to be from Dr. Grant herself, speaking in calm, methodical tones. Replication complete. Subject maintains full cognitive cohesion. Minor memory bleed. Containment required. Subject self-identifies as original. Correction necessary. Memory resets every 12 hours. Emotional anchors persist. In the background of one recording, you can hear something else, faint breathing, followed by the sound of heart monitors accelerating, then abruptly stopping. The files also included a blueprint of an underground facility labeled Echo 1, located directly beneath the original Beacon Hill Foundation. The schematics showed chambers designed for cognitive transfer testing and neural waveform storage. It became clear, the hospital was never just a place of healing. It was an incubator for consciousness itself. When a local construction crew accidentally breached part of the sealed foundation during a renovation project, they reported hearing mechanical humming from below. One worker described finding a steel hatch bolted shut with the words, "Do not reboot," scrawled in red. The next day, that section of the site was quietly cordoned off by federal contractors. The workers were paid in cash and told to forget what they'd seen. But one of them didn't. Weeks later, an anonymous video appeared online. The footage was blurry and dark, but it showed a long corridor lit by white lights. Along the walls were dozens of pods, transparent chambers filled with pale, still figures. Some looked half-formed, their features incomplete. Others looked perfectly human. Each pod was labeled with a patient code, L07, L08, L09. In one frame, you can clearly see a tag marked L, Heart, Replicant 12. The video cut off abruptly when alarms began to sound. The final frame showed one of the pods opening from the inside. Moments later, every copy of the video vanished from the internet. Hard drives containing it were corrupted beyond recovery. The few who had seen it before deletion described the final seconds as showing a reflection in the pod glass, not of the person filming, but of Dr. Eleanor Grant, smiling faintly, as if proud of her creation. Experts now believe the Echo protocol may never have been shut down, only decentralized, spreading across systems, hiding in hospital networks, replicating itself through code and memory alike. Some theorize that the recent wave of patients waking briefly after death may not be miracles at all, but echoes, fragments of consciousness bleeding through from failed transfers. Because if Grant succeeded in mapping human identity, then the human soul, or something like it, might now exist as data. And data, once created, never truly dies. It only waits to be reactivated. It started as a rumor, a mysterious data packet intercepted by a group of digital archivists scanning deep web channels for missing information related to Beacon Hill. The file was labeled simply, final_Orpheus_sequence. MP4. At first glance, it looked corrupted beyond repair, a black screen, bursts of static, distorted audio. But when they slowed the footage to 1 frame per second, something emerged, a timestamp reading 3 hours and 17 minutes, and a voice, faint but unmistakable. It was Dr. Eleanor Grant. Her voice was calm, even gentle, as if she were recording a final note for someone she once cared about. "If you're hearing this," she began, "then it means the transfer has completed. It means I'm gone, or that I'm not the version you remember." The archivists initially thought it was an old recording. But embedded within the file's metadata was a chilling discovery: it was created 2 weeks ago. In other words, the voice of a woman who had supposedly died years earlier was speaking in the present tense. Grant's message continued, fragmented by interference, as if something, or someone, didn't want it to be heard. "They think I'm lost, but I'm still here. The system remembers. Every signal leaves an echo. They can shut down the building, burn the records, erase the names, but they can't erase the pattern. The human mind isn't a soul, it's a frequency. Once you know how to capture that frequency, you can call it back." Behind her words, faint mechanical noises pulsed rhythmically, like ventilators or computer fans. Then a sharp metallic clang echoed, followed by her whispering, "It's waking up again. They're all waking up again." The screen flickered, and for a fraction of a second, the image stabilized, revealing a dimly lit control room filled with monitors. On one of them, a live feed displayed what appeared to be an operating theater. The date in the corner read October 5, 2025, the day before the file was discovered. In the footage, a surgical table was visible under bright white lights. Someone, or something, was lying on it, covered in a sheet. Electrodes lined the walls, all wired into a humming core machine labeled EchoCore/active. The machine's display showed a sequence of numbers cycling rapidly, then freezing on a single line of text, transfer complete, subject, G. Eleanor, stable. Moments later, the camera panned abruptly, revealing a silhouette standing in the corner of the room, a woman in a lab coat. Her hair was matted, her hands trembling. She approached the camera, leaned close, and whispered, "Do you remember me?" Then the feed cut to static. When digital forensics experts analyzed the file, they noticed something no one could explain: the spectral waveform of Grant's voice wasn't consistent with a single human source. It was layered, multiple versions of her speaking slightly out of sync, as if every iteration of her consciousness was trying to speak through the same signal. The archivists who found the file tried to trace its origin, but the data led nowhere. Every IP address looped back to Beacon Hill Memorial Hospital, a building that, officially, no longer existed. Yet somehow, its internal network remained active, transmitting small packets of encrypted data at 3:17 a.m. every single night. Government agencies denied involvement. When the archivists went public, their channel vanished overnight. The last upload they made was a single still image from the video, the moment where the phrase, "transfer complete," appeared. In the reflection of the surgical light above the table, you can barely make out a second figure, someone watching from the observation deck. Investigators enhanced the image, expecting to see Grant's assistant or a security officer. What they found was far stranger. The reflection matched the facial features of Lydia Hart. If true, it meant the consciousness of Lydia, or her replicated version, was somehow still operational, still connected to the original system. And if Grant's own consciousness had been uploaded next, then both might now coexist within the same digital network, not living, but not dead. Around that time, strange disturbances began to occur near the sealed remains of the Beacon Hill site. Locals reported flickering streetlights and power surges between 3:15 and 3:20 a.m. Surveillance cameras would glitch and replay the same few seconds of footage, showing a woman in hospital scrubs walking past, then dissolving into static. Security guards claimed they could hear a heartbeat through the walls, faint but synchronized with the electrical hum of the buried facility. Then came the hospital reactivation event. On a rainy night, just before dawn, several emergency dispatchers received simultaneous calls from disconnected hospital landlines. The voices on the other end all said the same thing: patient stable. Proceed to recovery. When responders traced the calls, they originated from within the hospital's long-demolished operating wing, specifically, Operating Room 3, the same room where the Orpheus experiments had taken place. Teams were sent to investigate. The entrance was sealed by concrete and steel, yet heat sensors registered a temperature spike, the same phenomenon noted the night the hospital was abandoned. The thermal cameras showed faint human shapes moving inside, even though no one could physically be there. A journalist later obtained a leaked report from the emergency response team. The final paragraph read, "Upon entry, all systems were inactive. No signs of forced access. However, surgical equipment was warm to the touch. The monitors displayed residual energy readings consistent with recent use. The clock on the wall showed 3:17 exactly." Shortly after the investigation, every member of that response team either transferred, retired, or disappeared. Their personnel files were redacted under federal security orders. Meanwhile, across the internet, fragments of the final Orpheus sequence began resurfacing, always at night, always corrupted, always ending with the same image: Dr. Grant's face fading into static, her final words echoing through the distortion: "If the mind can be copied, it can be called back. And if it can be called back, it can answer." Then, silence. But experts who analyzed the audio claimed that in the final second of the file, beneath the static, a single heartbeat could be heard, not mechanical, but human. And embedded within that heartbeat's waveform was an encrypted binary message that, when decoded, read, we are still here. To this day, no one knows whether the Echo protocol was ever truly shut down, or if it simply moved beyond physical form. Some believe the consciousnesses that once occupied Beacon Hill's halls still linger, passing through data streams, searching for new hosts. Others think the hospital itself became sentient, its systems woven from the minds it once held captive. All that remains certain is this: at 3:17 every morning, the old hospital's last surviving server, buried beneath layers of concrete, flickers to life for exactly 60 seconds. Then it shuts down again, as if exhaling. No one knows what happens in that minute. But some say, if you stand close enough to the ruins and listen carefully, you can still hear the faint hum of machines, the slow beep of monitors, and the voice of a woman whispering through the static.